the needle was still moving. That was the part Senior Analyst Vethkaras could not explain to her superiors. Not the battle, not the casualties, not even the breach of the Canandori line, which 7 separate strategic models had declared mathematically impossible. Those things, terrible as they were, had precedence somewhere in the archive. Somewhere in 4,000 years of recorded interstellar conflict, something analogous existed. But the needle on the human biometric display, the one measuring cortisol analogs, the one that was supposed to flatline when a creature reached the boundary of biological endurance, that needle was still moving, upward, after 31 hours of continuous engagement, after losses that should have triggered species-level psychological collapse. It wasn't spiking in distress. It was climbing like something waking up. Vethkaras had been stationed at forward observation post Murin 7 for 9 months before the humans arrived, and in those 9 months, she had developed what she privately considered a reasonable understanding of the species. Reasonable meaning. She had read the reports, reviewed the xenopsychological assessments, attended the briefings where hegemony analysts explained, with patient condescension, why humanity's recent admission to galactic space was unlikely to produce anything strategically significant for at least 3 generations. The assessment was not cruel. It was simply accurate by every framework the hegemony possessed. Humans were small, shorter-lived than average, metabolically inefficient, neurologically fragile in ways that made prolonged conflict psychologically catastrophic. Their technology lagged behind the Covenant median by approximately 80 years. Their military doctrine was, and this was the diplomatic phrasing from the official report, emotionally compromised asterisk, meaning their command decisions frequently prioritized the survival of individual units over strategic optimization. They mourned their dead. They named their equipment. They maintained non-tactical social bonds that created dangerous command hesitation. Every serious wargame simulation run against human fleets in the first 2 years of contact had produced the same result. Humans performed adequately in short engagements and catastrophically in prolonged ones. Their psychology simply couldn't sustain it. Vethkaras had believed this. She had filed her own supplementary reports echoing it. She had, on 3 separate occasions, used the phrase asterisk limited durability window to describe humanity's military relevance. She was thinking about that phrase now, watching the biometric needle as the battle entered its 32nd hour. Analyst Vethkaras. The voice belonged to Commander Sevdorath, who had not slept in 26 hours and looked it. What does your assessment say about human psychological threshold at this stage of engagement? She didn't answer immediately. Analyst. My assessment, she said carefully, was built on data from the first 2 years of contact. And I am no longer confident it applies. The Canandori engagement, that was what history would eventually call it, though on the day itself no one present had any certainty there would be a history to record it, had begun as something the hegemony's war council privately expected to be a demonstration. Not a battle, a demonstration. The Vorath Collective had moved against the 3 human colonial systems in Sector 9, with a force complement that the hegemony's own analysts described in their briefing materials as asterisk significantly disproportionate asterisk. This was accurate. The Vorath had deployed 4 fleet carriers, 17 escort cruisers, and a ground invasion force numbering in the hundreds of thousands against a human colonial presence that consisted of, at that moment, approximately 40,000 civilian settlers, a militia force that was technically classified as a defense unit, but had never actually defended anything, and a single hegemony observer vessel, Vethkaras's posting. That was present for diplomatic protocol purposes and explicitly prohibited from combat engagement. The War Council's private expectation was that humanity would negotiate, request hegemony mediation, accept terms, demonstrate in the process that they were not yet ready for the galactic stage, and perhaps learn something useful from the experience. The humans did not negotiate. They didn't even send a response to the Vorith's opening communication. Vethkaras remembered watching the timestamp on that unopened transmission and feeling the first flicker of something she hadn't expected to feel: uncertainty. "They didn't open it," she said to her communications officer. Confirmed, analyst. The transmission was received, no response logged. "Send it again." Already attempted, still no response. She turned back to the tactical display. The Vorith fleet had begun its approach vector. Standard doctrine said the human militia force, facing those numbers, should be retreating to a defensive perimeter, buying time, waiting for help that may or may not come. Instead, the human ships were accelerating toward the Vorith formation. Not in a defensive posture, not in a formation that suggested a last stand, in a posture that her tactical system, after a full 4 seconds of processing, classified with a confidence rating she had never seen applied to a species with humanity's resource profile: offensive assault pattern. "That's not possible," her tactical officer said. It was, and it was only the first thing that shouldn't have been. What Vethkaras did not know, what no hegemony analyst knew, because no one had thought to ask the question, was why the Vorith had chosen Sector 9. The official Vorith position, delivered later to hegemony mediators, was resource acquisition. The 3 human systems in Sector 9 contained viable mineral deposits and an atmosphere-compatible planet that the collective wanted for colonization. This was true, but it was not the complete truth. The complete truth, which Vethkaras would not discover for another 4 months, buried in a signal intercept that a junior analyst almost deleted as noise, was that the Vorith had specifically selected Sector 9 because of a strategic assessment they had commissioned 18 months earlier. That assessment, paid for and quietly shared with 2 other collective members, had concluded that humanity's Sector 9 presence was their most isolated and least defensible position. Strike there, the assessment argued, and humanity would have no choice but to accept terms. Strike there, and you demonstrate that the Deathworlders, the creatures that galactic gossip had begun to mythologize with increasing, annoying frequency, were mortal after all. Ordinary. Manageable. Strike there, and you puncture the legend before it inflates any further. The Vorith had not struck humanity at their weakest point by accident. They had done it deliberately as a message. What the Vorith did not understand, what the assessment had entirely failed to model, was that humanity had known about this assessment for 11 months. The first human vessel to make contact with the Vorith forward line was not a warship. It was a cargo hauler, a commercial freighter registered to a settler cooperative on the 3rd Colonial Station, carrying, according to its filed manifest, agricultural equipment and water reclamation supplies. The Vorith forward captain later reported that his crew had initially assumed it was fleeing. The approach vector was wrong for an attack. The vessel was broadcasting civilian distress codes. There was no tactical logic to a cargo hauler heading toward a fleet carrier at combat speed. He had ordered his point defense systems to stand by rather than fire, because destroying a civilian vessel, even an enemy's, required documentation that would slow the entire operation's administrative approval chain. The cargo hauler wasn't fleeing. It was carrying something the manifest did not list, and it detonated at a range that took out the forward captain's vessel, 2 escorts, and critically, the Vorith formation's primary sensor array. The Vorith fleet went partially blind in the first 4 minutes of the engagement. And then the human warships, the 6 ships that by all reasonable analysis should have retreated to a defensive perimeter, came through the sensor gap. They knew where the gap would be, Vethkaras said, watching it happen in real time on her display. Her voice was very quiet, Before the cargo hauler went in, they already knew where the gap would be. Her tactical officer was silent for a moment. Analyst, how long would that calculation require? For us, she ran the numbers automatically. 7 to 12 minutes of sensor feedback after the explosion. You'd need to analyze the debris pattern, model the array's coverage sphere, then. The human ships began their approach vector 40 seconds after the explosion. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at it for a long time. They calculated it before, she said. They already knew what the gap would look like. Before the hauler detonated. Before the hauler detonated. The tactical officer said nothing. There was nothing to say. If the humans had pre-calculated the sensor gap, that meant they had modeled the Vorath fleet's sensor array geometry before the battle began, which meant they had intelligence on Vorath military hardware specifications that no human institution was supposed to possess, which raised a question that sat in Veth Kharaz's mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she couldn't stop following. How long had the humans been preparing for this specific engagement? The battle lasted 37 hours. This fact alone, when it reached the Hegemony War Council, produced a silence that lasted nearly as long. The council had gathered expecting to discuss mediation terms. They had expected the human colonial presence in Sector 9 to be a concluded matter within 6 hours maximum. The Vorath were not a minor power. Their military record was extensive and largely unblemished. Their doctrine was efficient. Their equipment was modern. Their commanders were experienced. 37 hours. Veth Kharaz filed her preliminary report at hour 19, when she was still trying to understand what she was watching. She filed a second at hour 29, when understanding had given way to something closer to documentation of the incomprehensible. She was composing her third when the battle ended, and in the process of composing it, she deleted and rewrote its opening paragraph 11 times because she could not find language adequate to what had actually happened. What she finally wrote was, the duration of the engagement exceeded all models. Human forces did not exhibit the expected psychological degradation pattern. More critically, the degradation curve appeared to invert at approximately hour 18. Performance metrics improved. This has no precedent in hegemony strategic literature, and I am not certain my instruments are functioning correctly. Her instruments were functioning correctly. She knew they were because she had run 3 calibration checks, each one producing the same result, each time hopping for a different answer. At hour 18, something had changed in the human forces, not in their equipment, not in their tactics exactly, something in the humans themselves. The biometric readings she was capturing from the small number of human units close enough for her sensors to reach showed cortisol analog levels that should have been collapsing, should have been producing impaired cognition, degraded reaction time, emotional dysregulation that would cascade through their command structure. Instead, the levels were climbing, and the humans were getting faster. She found out why at hour 23, through a transmission intercept she almost missed. A human unit commander, she later matched the voice to a woman named Lieutenant Commander Priya Vasquez, commanding what remained of the human militia's ground defense on the 2nd Colonial Station, was speaking to someone whose signal was too degraded to reconstruct clearly. The conversation was brief. Most of it was technical, but one exchange survived the interference clearly enough to translate. "Hold on," the degraded voice said. "It might have been a question. It might have been an order." "How long?" Vasquez asked. A pause, 12 seconds of static. "Doesn't matter," Vasquez said before the answer came. "Tell me something else. Tell me the children got out." Another pause, this one shorter. "Good," Vasquez said. Her voice changed on that word. Veth Kharaz had listened to the recording 17 times since, and she still could not fully categorize the quality of it. It was quieter, and at the same time somehow harder. "Then we hold." The intercept ended. Veth Kharaz had noted it in her log and moved on, because she was tracking 17 other data streams simultaneously, and the tactical picture was demanding her full attention. She would not return to that particular intercept for several weeks. When she did, she would understand that she had been listening to the exact moment the battle turned, and she had misidentified its significance entirely. She had tagged the exchange as asterisk emotional expression, non-tactical asterisk, a human officer taking comfort from news of civilian evacuation. Understandable, human, irrelevant to the strategic picture. What she had not understood was that Vasquez's unit had received resupply confirmation at hour 19, that the children getting out was not a fact Vasquez was learning. It was a code phrase, and the code phrase meant something the hegemony's translation system, processing literal meaning, had no framework to catch. It meant the evacuation was a deception. The civilians are safe. The station is empty. You may use it. Vasquez's unit had been fighting for 23 hours to hold a position that contained no one. They had held it anyway, because holding it had convinced the Vorith's command structure that the station was still populated, still worth preserving, still a target requiring careful reduction rather than immediate bombardment. And that careful, methodical reduction had consumed the Vorith fleet's attention and ammunition budget for 23 hours, while something else was happening somewhere else. The answer to where that somewhere else was would arrive in Veth Karas's data stream 4 weeks later, attached to a debrief transcript she was never officially supposed to receive. When it did, she would sit very quietly for a long time, because the answer changed everything she had thought she understood about the first 19 hours of the battle, changed it so completely that she had to rebuild her interpretation of the entire engagement from the beginning. And the rebuilt interpretation was so much worse than the original. The Vorith fleet entered the battle expecting to absorb a human fighting force of 6 warships, militia units numbering perhaps 8,000 personnel, and whatever improvised defenses the settlers had managed to construct in the weeks since the Vorith's movements had become visible. They were correct about the 6 warships. They were correct about the militia numbers. They were not correct about the improvised defenses. The human settlement ships in Sector 9, the colony vessels that had delivered the 40,000 settlers over the preceding 8 years, had not been decommissioned. They had not been converted to storage or habitat use, as the Vorith's intelligence suggested, based on orbital scan data showing the ships in low-activity configuration. They had been, for 11 months, in the process of being refitted. Not into warships. The humans didn't have the industrial capacity for that, and the power signatures would have been detectable. They had been refitted into something with no exact hegemony equivalent, something that Veth Karas, reviewing the after-action engineering reports with a xenotech specialist, struggled to classify. The specialist eventually gave up on finding a proper category and used a phrase from the humans' own after-action documentation. Denial platforms, the humans had called them. Vessels with no offensive armament to speak of. No weapon systems the Vorith sensors would classify as a threat. Instead, disruption arrays, signature mimicry systems, and buried in the cargo holds of every single one of them, emergency beacon networks designed to create false sensor returns across a 5-light-minute sphere. The Vorith had spent the first 19 hours of the battle, destroying what their sensors told them were human defensive positions. The sensors had been lying for 19 hours. Not all of the positions were false. That was the specific cruelty of the design. Some of the positions were real, just enough of them, and Vasquez's unit on the second station was one of them. Human beings holding actual ground, actual positions, absorbing actual fire, because if all of the positions had been false, the Vorith sensors might have registered the pattern. You needed real resistance to make the fake resistance believable. Human beings dying for 19 hours to make the map look right. At hour 19, when the Vorith fleet had consumed the majority of its ground reduction ammunition on positions that didn't exist, had repositioned twice in response to false signals, had sent 2 of its carriers to the opposite side of the system to deal with a threat cluster that turned out to be sensor ghosts. At hour 19, the 6 human warship stopped running their defensive patterns. They attacked, and the Vorath, already deep into a 37-hour engagement, already logistically strained, already psychologically processing a battle that kept refusing to resolve on schedule, found themselves facing something their strategic models had not accounted for. A human fleet that had spent 19 hours appearing to be losing. That had not been losing. That had been waiting. Vethkaras requested a direct communication uplink to the human command vessel at hour 27. She had no authority to intervene in the battle. Her observer status was explicit. But she had authority to communicate, and she exercised it, because watching what was unfolding on her tactical display had produced in her a feeling she couldn't name but recognized as important. It took 11 minutes to get a response. When it came, the voice was calm, unhurried. This was the detail that stayed with her afterward, the unhurriedness. "Observer Vessel Murin 7, the voice said. "This is Captain Arjun Mehta, HMSV persistent question. Go ahead." "Captain Mehta," she chose her words with care. "I am not communicating in an official capacity. I want you to understand that. I am asking personally whether your forces require assistance." A pause, not a hesitation. A pause that felt deliberate, as if he was deciding something. "We don't," he said. "Captain, I have tactical data showing." Analyst Vethkaras. He knew her name. She had not given it. She noted this and set it aside. "I know what your tactical data shows. I want to ask you something if that's acceptable." "Yes." "How long," he said, "have your people been watching ours?" She didn't answer immediately. "Since first contact," she said finally, "approximately 4 years." 4 years, he repeated, not an echo, something else. "And in 4 years, what did you conclude?" She thought about the reports, the asterisk limited durability window, the phrase she had used 3 times. That humanity had limitations, she said. "We do," he said. Something shifted in his tone, not anger, not irony, something she had no word for in her language or any translation. "We have a lot of them." Another pause, longer. "But we've known about the Vorath assessment since 14 months ago," he said. "The one they commissioned about Sector 9, the one that found our weakest point." She was very still. "We moved 60,000 people into what the assessment considered our most vulnerable system," Mehta said. "We reduced the station garrison, ran standard patrol patterns, made everything look exactly as weak as the assessment said it was. We filed commercial shipping manifests for agricultural equipment. We did not respond to aggressive posturing. We waited." "You wanted them to attack Sector 9, she said. "We needed to know," he said quietly, "what they'd bring." The communication ended 30 seconds later, when his tactical crew called him back to the bridge. Vethkaras sat in her observation chair and looked at her displays for a long time. She had a new question now, a question that was larger than all the previous ones that consumed them, that made the mystery of the biometric needle and the mystery of the sensor gap and the mystery of the denial platforms feel like the outer edge of something she hadn't seen the shape of yet. 60,000 settlers. He had said 60,000 people were moved into that system, the system that the humans had deliberately made look vulnerable, that they had waited for 14 months for the Vorath to strike. 40,000 had been on the official census. She checked her records, 40,000. It had been in every briefing, every hegemony report, every Vorath intelligence assessment. 60,000. 20,000 people the census didn't show. 20,000 people somewhere in the Sector 9 system, unaccounted for, during a battle that was now entering hour 28. Where were the other 20,000? She found out at hour 31. The Vorith fleet's final carrier, the last major surface-capable vessel still operationally functional, began an emergency retreat vector at hour 31, 14 minutes. It had been attempting to exit the engagement since hour 29, executing a slow withdrawal under covering fire from its two remaining escorts. What stopped it was not the human warships. They were fully engaged with the escorts. What stopped it was a vessel that appeared on the tactical display from a location that should have contained nothing. A location on the far edge of the system that Vorith sensor data and hegemony sensor data had shown as empty debris field for the entire duration of the engagement. The vessel was large, not warship large, colony ship large, running no active signatures, no power emissions consistent with weapons, just mass and momentum positioned in the carrier's only viable exit vector at a distance that made navigating around it a 40-minute proposition the carrier's fuel budget could not afford. A colony ship full of civilians blocking the exit. Or what the Vorith captain had to assume was a colony ship full of civilians. Because if he fired on it, and he later testified, in a deposition that Veth Kara's obtained through channels she never formally disclosed, if he fired on it, and it turned out to be full of civilians, the legal and diplomatic consequences would end his collective's military program for a generation. The hegemony would intervene. Every species watching the engagement, and many were watching, would respond. He couldn't fire on it. He couldn't go around it. He sat in the exit vector for 40 minutes, burning fuel he didn't have, while the human warships finished the escorts and came for him. Veth Kara's later reviewed the colony ship's internal logs, which were provided to her by the human command in a data package whose cheerful comprehensiveness she found, in retrospect, deliberate. The ship's crew complement at the time of the blocking maneuver, 22 people, volunteer crew. The ship's passenger manifest, empty. The 20,000 missing settlers were not on it. They were on 6 smaller vessels, already beyond the system boundary, already safe, having departed in the first 4 hours of the battle when the Vorith fleet's attention was fully occupied with positions that didn't exist. 20,000 people the Vorith never knew were in danger because they were never in danger, because the humans had moved them before the battle began, leaving behind 22 volunteers in an empty ship to use as a blocking piece in the final move of a sequence that had been planned before the first shot was fired. She thought about Vasquez's transmission. The children got out. Not comfort, confirmation. She thought about what it meant that Vasquez had needed that confirmation, had needed to know the sequence was proceeding, before she would hold her position through hour 23. Vasquez had not been taking comfort. She had been checking the plan. Veth Kara's looked at the biometric data she'd been recording all day, the needle that climbed instead of fell, the cortisol analog that inverted. She understood it now, and understanding it was worse than the mystery had been. It wasn't that humans didn't feel fear. It wasn't that they were impervious to suffering, immune to exhaustion, beyond the reach of the psychological degradation that prolonged conflict inflicted on every other known species. They felt all of it. The biometric data was accurate. They felt all of it, and the knowing that others were safe, that the people they had chosen to protect were beyond harm, converted it, changed the chemistry, not into calm, not into numbness, into something that had no equivalent in hegemony psychology literature, something that burned instead of froze. At hour 37, with the last Vorith vessel in custody and the engagement formally concluded, Veth Kara's sent a final transmission to Captain Maida's vessel. She had one question. "Captain, how many people knew the full plan?" The response came back in 40 seconds. "Everyone," he said. She stared at that word. "Everyone," she repeated. Every settler, every militia member, every crew on every denial platform. His voice was even, matter of fact. This only works if everyone knows what they're protecting and why. You can't ask people to hold a position they don't understand. You can't ask them to risk everything for a plan that was handed down from command. A pause. They all voted on it, he said. They all voted on it. Veth Karas closed the channel. She sat in her observation chair in the quiet of her instruments and looked at her displays and tried to find a strategic framework that could contain what she just heard. 60,000 people. A plan 14 months in the making. A deliberate provocation of a militarily superior force. Real soldiers holding real positions and dying in them, not because they were ordered to, but because they had collectively decided that was what the plan required, and they had looked at the plan and agreed it was worth it. No supreme command, no authority imposing sacrifice from above. 60,000 people who looked at what was coming and chose, together, how to meet it. She filed her third report that evening. She rewrote the opening paragraph once. Only once, because she had found the right words on the second attempt, and she knew they were right because they were the first words she had written in this whole engagement that she was certain were true. I have made an error in my foundational assessment of this species. The error was not in any individual data point. The error was categorical. I treated humanity's psychology as a liability to be managed and a weakness to be exploited in conflict. I now believe this is precisely backwards. I believe human psychology in extremis is not a degradation of their function, but an amplification of it, and that the specific mechanism of this amplification has no analog in any species profile currently held by the hegemony. I believe the Vorath Collective made the same categorical error I did. They identified humanity's weakest system. They applied maximum force to that system. They expected the result that logic and precedent predicted. What they encountered instead was a species that had spent 14 months preparing a specific welcome for exactly this kind of attack. A species that knew it would come, knew what it would look like, and had 60,000 people who agreed in advance on what they were willing to pay. I do not know if humanity can be understood. I am no longer certain that understanding them is the relevant question. The relevant question, I believe, is what they choose to do next. The answer to that question came 3 weeks later, when humanity filed a formal diplomatic communication to the hegemony's full council. Not a protest, not a demand for reparations, not even an accusation nomming the 2 collective members who had co-funded the Vorath strategic assessment. A question. A single, formally worded diplomatic question attached to a data package that contained complete, verified, and impeccably sourced the full text of the Vorath's commissioned assessment, the names of the co-funders, the financial transfer records, the dates. The question was, given the contents of the attached documentation, does the Hegemony Council wish to address this matter, or shall we? The council chamber, by all accounts from members who were present, went very quiet. Because the question was not a threat, it was structured as a genuine inquiry, and the genuine inquiry in context was somehow more frightening than a threat would have been. A threat could be evaluated, weighed against capability, measured. This was something else. This was a species that had just survived a coordinated assault it had deliberately allowed to be launched against itself, that had produced a battle which every serious military analyst in known space was now studying with growing discomfort, that was in possession of intelligence suggesting 2 other collective members had participated in the planning. Asking politely whether anyone else wanted to handle it. The council voted to address the matter within 2 hours. This was, at the time, the fastest vote on record for any matter not classified as an immediate existential emergency. Veth Karas watched the vote from her station, already 3 weeks into the analysis work that would occupy the next 2 years of her career. She was building a new framework, not a strategic model exactly, something harder to name, An attempt to describe a species whose specific gravity she kept underestimating, not because she was careless, but because the thing she kept failing to account for was not in any data category she had been trained to measure. The thing was this: every other species the hegemony had contact with, when they reached their limit, stopped. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked courage, because stopping when you had reached the rational boundary, when the cost exceeded the projected return, when the models said the outcome was no longer viable, stopping was what intelligence looked like. It was what having a self-preservation instinct looked like. It was what sanity looked like. Humans had a self-preservation instinct. She had seen the biometric data. They felt the fear. They had something else too. Something that sat beside the fear and did not contradict it and was not stronger than it in any simple sense, but that when the fear said stop asterisk, produced a question in response. Not a denial, a question. Stop for what? And if the answer to that question, if the reason that stopping would be rational, if that reason was we will lose less, we will survive more intact, we will preserve ourselves, humans could look at that reason and find it insufficient. Not because they wanted to die, not because they were reckless, because survival for them was not the terminal value. Survival was instrumental. Survival was the tool you used to protect the things that survival was for. Take the thing that survival is for and put it outside the system. Evacuate the children. Secure the people. Ensure that what matters is already safe, and the calculus changed entirely. Because then the question of whether to continue was no longer a question about survival. It was a question about price. And Vethkaras had now seen twice what happened when you asked a human that question. They did the math, transparently, collectively, with full knowledge of what the answer would cost. And then they paid it. She saved her draft framework, looked out the observation port at the stars, thought about the empty colony ship and 22 volunteers and Vasquez in the static saying good in that quiet, hard voice. She thought about a species that could do the thing it had done at Canandori, not in rage, not in desperation, not because they had no other choice, but because they had looked 14 months ahead and seen the moment coming, and decided with clear eyes and a full vote that when it arrived, this was the answer they would give. She thought about the Hegemony Council and the 2 collective members who had co-funded the assessment, and the question that humanity had sent to the chamber. Shall we? She had spent 4 years studying humans. She had filed dozens of reports about their limitations. She had used the phrase asterisk limited durability window 3 times in official documents. She opened a new file. At the top of it, she typed a single line, not for submission, not for any record, only because she needed to put the thought somewhere outside her own head before it became the only thing in there. We have been measuring how long they can last. We never asked how long they planned for. The stars outside her window didn't move. Somewhere in those stars, Captain Maida's ship, the asterisk persistent question asterisk, and she finally understood the name. She understood it all the way down, was on its way to coordinates the hegemony had not been given. 60,000 people were safe. 22 volunteers had stepped off an empty ship into a transport they'd staged 3 days prior, already well outside the engagement zone, already home. Vasquez was in a medical bay on the first station. She would survive. She would be promoted. She would, 2 years later, be one of the architects of the doctrine that the Hegemony's War Council would eventually classify under a category they created specifically for it, because no existing category was adequate. The Vorath Collective accepted hegemony mediation within the week. The 2 co-funding members of the assessment quietly transferred the relevant colonial survey rights to human authority without waiting to be asked, which the hegemony's diplomatic corps noted was unprecedented in the collective's 300-year institutional history. No one called it fear. but in the private correspondence of the collective's senior council members, a correspondence that reached Veth Karas through channels she still has not disclosed. One phrase appeared repeatedly, in slightly different forms, across multiple documents written by members who had not compared notes. We thought we knew which system they couldn't afford to lose. We were wrong. They let us pick. The stars still didn't move. Somewhere in the space between them, in the quiet after the battle and before whatever came next, a species that had just been attacked at its deliberately chosen weakest point was filing diplomatic correspondence and running vote tallies and moving people to wherever the people needed to be. Not celebrating, not resting, planning. They were always planning. That was the thing Veth Karas wrote at the end of her framework, the line she returned to every time a new piece of data came in and changed something she thought she understood, the line she eventually submitted with her full report to the Hegemony Council's closed session 2 years later. The line that produced, by the record of the session, a silence lasting 4 minutes and 17 seconds before anyone spoke. Humanity is not the strongest species in this galaxy. They are not the fastest, the most advanced, or the longest lived. They have more documented biological vulnerabilities than any Deathworld species on record, and a psychology so emotionally entangled with its own social bonds that it should, by every model we possess, be catastrophically exploitable. It isn't. Because what we model as vulnerability, they experience as fuel. And what we call a limit, they call a starting point. The most dangerous thing about humanity is not what they are willing to do. It's that they already know what it will cost. They've discussed it. They've voted. They've made their peace with the number.